Do you like having 4 laser shooting spaceships following you around? Do you want to heal by doing damage? Do you like technology? Well then Sage might be the job for you. Hello and welcome to the Final Fantasy XIV Sage Guide. In this video I'll be going over the abilities, utility and DPS rotation of the Sage job at level 90. However, before I do this, let me point at this analytics screenshot and ask you to subscribe if you find my guides helpful. A raid party in Final Fantasy consists of 2 tanks, 2 healers and 4 DPS. Sage fills one of the 2 healer spots in the party. It does so alongside White Mage, Scholar and Astrologian. Sage alongside Scholar is considered a barrier healer, whereas White Mage and Astrologians are considered regen healers. Both have various healing and shielding abilities. However, barrier healers have a kit that focuses more on mitigation and shielding, while regen healers have a kit that focuses on doing more raw heals and regens. Furthermore, Sage has an ability called Cardia, which is an indefinite buff they can apply to any party member, similar to a dancer's dance partner. Whenever the Sage then uses a offensive GCD, their Cardiad partner gets healed for a small amount of potency. It's also worth mentioning that in Final Fantasy, healers are basically caster DPS with an extra responsibility. The DPS check and enrages are balanced around healers contributing around 15% of the total raid DPS. That's why it's important to not only learn how to heal, but also on how to DPS. Before we dive into all the different spells and abilities Sage has access to, let's cover the job gauge. The job gauge consists of 3 elements. 3 gems at the top, a gauge in the middle and then 3 gems at the bottom. The top 3 gems represent your Adder's Gold charges. Each can be spent on one of 4 spells which we will cover later. A single Adder's Gold charge recovers over the course of 20 seconds. This 20-second timer is represented by the gauge in the middle. The bottom 3 gems represent your Adder Sting charges. These can be spent on instant cast abilities, which are great for movement. You start combat with 3 of these available, and they are recharged when your single target barrier, your Eucrosian Diagnosis, gets consumed. Like mentioned before, it is important for healers to try to maximize the DPS, as the enrage timer assumes healers contribute a sizable amount of the party's total DPS. With this in mind, let's talk about the DPS spells and abilities Sage has access to. Doses is your main filler spell. This spell has a cast time of 1.5 seconds and a recast time of 2.5 seconds. This means you can weave a single OGCD after each cast, and this allows you to move for a second in between each cast without losing any uptime. Eucrasia is an instant cast GCD that allows you to augment a few spells, buffing them or modifying their behavior. Using this spell alongside doses gives us access to Eucrasian doses free. This ability applies a damage over time debuff to a target which persists for 30 seconds. Keep this damage over time applied at all times. It is worth noting that you cannot weave OGCDs after Eucrasia, however you can weave after a Eucrasia modified spell. These 3 spells make up the gross of your rotation, however there are 3 more spells that are used for DPS. Phlegma is a short-range, hard-hitting instant cast spell with a 4 to 5 seconds cooldown, which can store up to 2 charges. Use this in the opener, which we will discuss soon. Afterwards, try to align this for usage inside of your party's raid buffs. Try to not let it overcap its cooldown though, and use it before it would do so. Also, I would like to mention that it is worth using this spell for movement instead of pulling them for raid buffs if this results in a higher uptime. Toxicon 2 is an instant cast spell which has the exact same recast time and potency as Doses. You can use this spell if you have Adder Sting charges. Try to use this spell for moments of extended movement. Lastly, Discratia 2 is your instant cast AoE spell. Replace Doses with this spell when you are able to hit 2 or more targets with it. The Sage opener is pretty straightforward. Precast Doses free at about 1.5 seconds left, and then use Eucrasia and cast Eucratian Doses Free. Cast 2 more Doses Frees, and then use both Phlegmite Free charges before continuing to fill out the rotation with doses. Here's an example of the opener being done. After the opener, maintain uptime by casting doses and ensure your damage over time does not fall off by reapplying Eucratian Doses Free right before it expires. Try to prevent Phlegma from overcapping charges while pulling for the next raid buffs windows that come up at the even minute marks. Use Toxicon 2 for moments of extended movement, and also do not feel afraid to use Phlegma for movement instead of pulling for raid buffs. Sage naturally has a load of different shielding, healing and mitigation spells and abilities in its kit. Let's go over all of them. Like mentioned before, Cardia is a very important part of the Sage's kit and identity. Using this ability on an ally grants them an indefinite buff, which heals them whenever the Sage uses an offensive GCD, such as Doses, Phlegma, Toxicon or Discrasia. Due to the constant healing, it is not a bad idea to put this buff on the main tank. However, a good Sage will swap the buff around between the 2 tanks to have it sit on the tank who is currently taking auto attacks, or even onto a DPS player if they take increased single target damage due to mechanics or mess ups. Next, let's talk about your Adder Skull's abilities. These can only be cast if you have access to an Adder Skull charge, which are displayed as the top 3 gems on your job gauge. You gain one of these charges once every 20 seconds, which is displayed by the gauge in the middle of your job gauge. All of these spells restore 7% of your maximum mana, so you should try to prevent these charges from overcapping as they are key to maintaining your mana pool. The first ability is called Caracol. This ability places a buff on the Sage and all nearby allies, which mitigates damage by 10% and applies a small but potent regen for 15 seconds. This ability is incredibly strong and should be your go-to way of dealing with incoming raid wights. Next is Ixocol. This is a straightforward AoE heal on a 30-second cooldown. Taracol is a potent single target heal with a 45-second cooldown. It also applies a 10% damage mitigation buff to the target for the next 15 seconds. It is important to mention that this mitigation does not stack with the mitigation given from Caracol. Lastly, Druocol is a single target heal with slightly less potency than Taracol. It has a 1 second recast time and should be your go-to spell to prevent your Adder Skull from overcapping. Aside from these Adder Skull abilities, Sage has access to a few more abilities that helps them heal and shield. Physis is an AoE regen that increases healing received from all sources by 10% with a 60-second cooldown. Try to use this as often as possible on raid wights. Hollows heals the party for a moderate amount, then shields based on the amount healed, and lastly reduces incoming damage by 10%. Try to use this ability when raid wight damage is happening back to back, or if your party is low on health before a raid wight. It is naturally ideal to gain benefit from all 3 aspects of this ability, however it is fine to use if you only make use of the shield and the mitigation aspects. Haima applies a shield to a target which when consumed reapplies itself up to 5 times. If by the end of the 15-second duration unused charges of Haima still remain, it instead uses the remaining charges to apply a small heal which scales with each remaining charge. Penhaima is the AoE version of Haima. The shield and heal is slightly less potent, but you can combine these with other AoE shields to deal with hard hitting or repetitive hitting raid wights like bleeds. Alongside these OGCDs, Sage has access to a few GCD spells. Try avoid using these if possible, as you lose damage in doing so. Only use them in emergencies or for the sake of safety in progression. Diagnosis is a single target GCD with a low potency. You can and should combo this with Eucrasia to turn it into Eucratian Diagnosis, which then alongside the heal also grants a barrier based on the HP restored. If the shield from Diagnosis gets consumed within its duration, you will gain access to an Adder Sting charge, which can be spent on a Toxicon too. Try to apply this shield during downtime to party members who you are certain will use it up, like the tanks. Prognosis is the AoE variant of Diagnosis. The same rule applies for Eucrasia for Prognosis, turning it into Eucrasian Prognosis. Icarus is your movement ability. You can use this to quickly rush towards any targeted enemy or party member. Lastly, you have Pneuma. This spell has the exact same potency as Dosis, but also has a potent AoE heal. Do not feel afraid to use this spell as it's DPS neutral. Then, Sage has a few abilities that didn't fit in with any other category. Soteria grants you a buff that increases the healing onto your Cardiac partner by 70%. This works great if your partner is taking sustained single target damage from a dot or similar mechanic. Zoe increases the potency of your next GCD heal by 50%. You can combine this with Pneuma to make it the strongest raw healing spell in the game without sacrificing any damage. For prog and ultimates, it is often used with Eucrasian Prognosis for a massive shield. Tapsis converts all of the barriers from Diagnosis and Prognosis into healing. This ability does not see frequent usage, however it can be used to heal up Doom type mechanics which require the players to be topped up to resolve. Rizomada grants you a free charge of Adderskull on a 90-second cooldown. As Adderskull abilities grant you mana, it is possible to use this for mana recovery if needed, but it can also be held for recovery after deaths or situation where you're in dire need for extra Adderskull heals. Krasis applies a buff to a single target, boosting all healing they receive by 20%. Use this on party members that are taking sustained damage or are in need of constant single target healing. It works great with Cardia and stacks with Soteria. Lastly, Sage naturally has access to the healer role actions. Swiftcast makes your next spell instant cast. Egerio resurrects a fallen party member after a long 8-second cast. This spell also costs a large heap of mana. Typically you would use Swiftcast in combination with this spell to mitigate the long cast time. Asuna cleanses a single dispellable debuff from a target. These debuffs can be recognized by a blue line above their icon. This is what they look like. Lucid Dreaming gradually restores your mana over the course of 21 seconds. Use this ability frequently to maintain your mana pool. Shorecast is your knockback immunity. It also doubles up in usage as it prevents your cast from being interrupted by mechanics that would otherwise do so. Rescue allows you to pull one party member towards you. You can use this to save a party member who you can see standing in the wrong place for a mechanic. However, if you are not confident in the usage, you can actually end up doing more harm than good with this spell. So, use this ability carefully. Thank you for watching my Sage guide. I hope you enjoyed and learned something new. A special thanks to Raw for providing the background footage of the guide. And a reminder to subscribe if you enjoyed the guide or found it useful.